All right. Well, I will go ahead and get us started right now. And just as a reminder, if you do want to chat with us with 20 people, we'll try to keep ourselves muted unless we're talking, just so there's not feedback or anything. And also, just in case someone wanders into your office, which has definitely happened to me before, in the middle of a webinar or conference call. So there should be in the bottom, at least on mine, in the bottom left-hand screen, there should be your little microphone. You can click mute to mute yourself, and then unmute when you do want to talk. And if you have a comment or want to join in, if you would just type into the chat box, which again, if you're at the bottom portion, you can click chat, and that should bring up a chat screen on the right-hand side, that you could let me know that you'd like to chime in, or really, I think with about 21 people, if we just unmute, I think that would work too. But thanks so much. I'm so glad there's so many people, and Vicki and I were both super excited to have everybody that was so interested in this. We were pretty surprised at how large the group, and especially on Slack, I think we have like 170 people on Slack too, that wanted to chat about books. So that's awesome. Vicki, I don't know if I don't want to put you on the spot, but if you wanted to say hello, feel free to unmute yourself and say hi to everyone. Can't hear you, so you get the unmute button. Still can't hear Vicki. No. All right, Vicki's having some trouble unmuting there. At least from...
Can you hear me now?
Yes, there we go.
Okay. Yes, hi everyone. Thank you all for joining us. This is very exciting. What I thought was going to be a small group for a reading list has turned into something nice and good networking. So very excited about this. And sorry, I got really wet going to work today. It was raining, and I commute via mass transit, and the wind was blowing, and so umbrellas are only so good.
All right, perfect. And I see a couple other people I just kind of checked in with Slack. Thank you to Daniel for putting up the Zoom link on there. It was in that document, but not everybody probably saw that document that I put on the Slack channel. So hopefully we've got most of those people that were interested in chatting with us over there. So I'll go ahead and get us started with kind of the first question that I kind of saw either on Slack or just some that I had written out. And since let me see how many people we have. We got about 23 people. So I'm going to go ahead and say, if you do want to chime in, just unmute yourself and start talking. If that gets too complicated, we'll go to the chat and calling on people. But with 20-ish people, it shouldn't be too bad if we all just unmute when we want to talk, mute when you're not talking, so there's not that feedback. So my first question really was, what did you already know about this book, kind of about the subject of data visualization before you read the book? So who wants to start? And yes, we are recording this. I'm going to type the question on the side there just so people can respond.
So I'll share. My name's Sarah Oosby. I'm the Director of Assessment at the University of North Texas, a Director of Assessment for Student Affairs. So I found the book really interesting. I have a background in graphic design and have a marketing degree for my undergraduate degree, and so have worked in doing design work previously in my career. But I really loved that she took it and simplified it for how we can use it using Microsoft Office. And really like giving us some layman terms for how we interact with that. Because I think people do often get caught up in this, like, well, I don't have these design softwares and I don't have access to these things. So I really appreciated that. I also loved that we really got into this discussion about like academic writing and how we often feel like things need to be presented a certain way to be seen as serious, but that it's okay to kind of push back against that to show that people are gonna retain this more, even if I maybe not perceived as serious, they're gonna learn from it, and that's gonna really, that cycle will eventually kind of turn over. Is kind of what I took from it, was you You might initially have, some people who are resistant to that, but over time, as they start to see that they're really retaining that data and that their presentations are more effective, I think it almost becomes a solution in and of itself.
Absolutely. Thank you, Sarah, right? I believe that's your name down there. Anybody else? Anything you already knew about this before you started reading?
Well, as an institutional researcher, there are many offices that have been using this book and incorporating it into their work. And I had not, so I thought it was well overdue time. So, and it's been great. I've really enjoyed the book. So found it very helpful. Thought I knew about data visualization due to my job and had so much more to learn.
Yeah, it's definitely a very broad field. And there are several other more advanced books out there on it as well. And Sarah mentioned she had a background in graphic design, and I'm sure she has a lot more advanced resources on color choices and icons and that kind of thing. But I think it's really important for us as academics that have assessment data that sometimes people are resistant to learning about. I think it's really important for us to be able to present that data. So I'm glad that the group voted and chose this book. Michelle says, I started talking, but I don't know if people can hear me. No, Michelle, we did not hear you. And Yehu, I'm attempting to say your name, and I apologize if I'm mispronouncing that. That typing is fine. I'm kind of watching the sidebar there. And Michelle, if you unmute yourself and start talking, we will hopefully hear you, but right now I don't hear anything from Michelle. So, and Leah has the sidebar there too for us. I think some of us did it. I'm guessing that some people had no background in data visualization. Does anyone want to chime in for that side, that this is brand new to them? Oh, there's one person with no background. Perfect. Yeah, I think this was a really good intro book. For those of you that don't have that background, did you feel that this was like kind of a good introduction? Was this at the appropriate kind of level? Oh, there's Michelle.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, okay. I missed your first question. You're now onto the second one. Did you still want me to respond, or?
Either way, we've only got about 23 of us here, so.
Okay, I'll just say really briefly, my background is ed psych, so I really appreciate it when she started to talk about how the way you present data can impact your working memory. And so I know when I first started in the assessment world and looking at the way that how you might present data could help or hinder certain people who might feel very comfortable or not so comfortable with data. And so even just understanding, like presenting data from increasing to decreasing or vice versa, or just like trying to help people to understand those patterns and trends, the things that you might do from that perspective, I definitely was in agreement with that.
Absolutely, yeah. I agree as well. So yeah, I've got a couple other people say that they didn't have a background in this, and that's excellent. I mean, I hope that's what this group does for everybody, is we have a chance to learn something new. So I'm gonna kind of go over to my next question here. So Richard, yesterday, I think on the Slack discussion board, asked, how do we find Evergreen's book speaking to or not speaking to the styles and manners of our home academic disciplines? So for like, if someone's trained in hard science, are you approaching this data visualization with a different mindset and academic tool set than humanities or fine arts? So if anyone wants to speak to just their typical academic discipline, where they come from, and how this book kind of related or didn't relate to that. And I'm going to copy that question into the sidebar so you can read it.
So I guess I'll just say, like Michelle, I'm from educational psychology, and my work, though, is a little bit different than at psych in terms of, it takes theory, but we're a lot of practice, a lot of practical work. And so sometimes it feels like I should still be always using APA for things like tables and all. However, IR has really progressed so much that we need to do better. We need to, we need to keep drawing people in and providing things that are reader friendly and made for our audience. So that's sometimes a challenge for me to not make things too bland. So it's in terms of, some of my audience is not faculty or academics, so I have to think differently about different audiences.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. It's not only what background are we coming from, but what department or what college within our institution are we trying to talk to right now? And what are they going to respond to when we're presenting that data? Are they more interested in the hard numbers? Are they more interested in if we have some qualitative data to report? So I think that's really important as well. Anybody else on your home departments or background and how that kind of shaped your thoughts on data visualization?
Well, I'll jump in. Hey, everyone, this is Richard Parent, and that was my question. And, it's interesting. I come from rhetoric, and so visual rhetoric is second nature to me. So this book was, it was filled with really good ideas. But hearing, the point about I need to make my data less bland, for me, that's so fascinating because from a visual rhetoric standpoint, you want everything to be as not bland as possible so that it can have impact. But from a social sciences perspective or art sciences perspective, if you're too flashy, then it's not persuasive. And so there's interesting ways in which the way we come at this either opens up doors for certain audiences or shuts them in other ways. So I find this very interesting.
Richard, that's a funny comment. So when I was still a doctoral student and I was already working in institutional research full time, and some of the faculty would say, you make things that are, and they use the terms too sexy. Yeah. I thought that was always funny. I'm like, I don't understand. But if I'm producing something for, depending if it's for advancement or foundations, they really don't get into some of my more bland stuff. So are a little bit less, I guess, fancy. So I think that's a great comment.
We have a little bit of this too. I'm Elizabeth. I'm a research analyst at Arkansas State. I'm not sure if y'all can hear me.
Yeah, I can hear you, yeah.
Okay. So what I liked about this was we have different disciplines who like to look at data in different ways. So our hard sciences definitely want to see hard numbers. So for them, you can shoot them an Excel spreadsheet with numbers in it and they get it. And they can make their own inferences and they analyze it themselves. But then we have some people who if you send them a spreadsheet full of numbers, they go, what am I looking at? And they want the tables. They want it to already be organized. And so I liked this book because it gave better ways of organizing data for lots of different disciplines.
Yeah, absolutely. I would agree. And I kind of have a mixed background. My first degree was in biology, so the softer side of science. But with a large appreciation of numbers and statistics, and that more research bench science focus. And then I transitioned into social sciences. So I think it is really important to realize that each one of those disciplines functions very differently and understands very differently and appreciates data in a different way. And we have another question over here on the sidebar. And it's, how do we know the right level of fancy for our audience, and what features make it sexy versus not? So I don't know, Vicki, if you want to define sexy data or reporting a little bit better.
I don't know exactly if there's one thing, but even some of the things like titles for research projects that I would do with one of our education policy centers, some of my faculty were like, that's just too sexy and your tables are too fancy. And probably part of that was they had color in them and they didn't necessarily follow APA guidelines. You know, we were doing a lot of that work for it was a kind of a cradle to grave kind of group, frankly. I mean, that's what they are. And they follow the lifespan from growing up. And so we're often out at communities within representing the university. And so some of the communities didn't want to see things that didn't draw them in. You know, a lot of our presentations included great stock photos of, you know, things that would tie into their community. So we were often in Native American communities, and so we really worked hard to tie into what was important in the community. So for my faculty, because a couple of them would do some data analysis with us, they just found that it just wasn't intriguing to them, or so I don't know if that's really a good term for sexy or not, but that was their term. And I think that's what they
I could definitely see the title being an issue there. I think we've seen it more in recent years, especially at conferences, the title's getting more and more catchy, trying to draw people in to your conference presentation or your poster presentation. So I definitely, the sexy title thing resonates. But this kind of leads into our next question that I have over here. Or what are some of the tips? Because essentially this is what her first chapter was about there. What are some either tips you can take from this book when someone says, we don't have time to make it pretty, or the making it pretty isn't important for this audience, or how do we know what the right amount of pretty or visualization is for a different audience? And I attempted to type that question in there. Don't know if it appeared or not, but there we go. All right. There we go. All right. So I added that question into the sidebar as well. So if anyone wants to respond about how you would approach that, we don't have time, or this isn't important to us, based on kind of that first chapter.
So we don't have time, I'll just chime in. I was my first year here at the University of Dallas. I was a one-person office and carrying all the functions of institutional research. And so there wasn't a lot of extra time. And so sometimes I would be doing something that I needed to provide for foundations, and they would often say, oh, you know, that is just, I don't get what you're showing me. And so what I did was I went out and I looked at some of the things that they produced over time, and went to a couple of websites that were kind of similar to us and looked at what their foundation might have produced. So I could get an idea of what they mean, because I didn't, you know, foundations and advancement are a little different. I don't have a graphics background, and you know, they have graphics editor and things that I'm not. And so that's been a little bit of a challenge. You know, I'm really pretty good at working with different departments in terms of what they would like. Like, I know what English now kind of likes, because I've done a lot of work with English departments, and physics, how they're different than what math wants. So, and I don't know, I think that's just things that I've picked up over time. I don't know. And yes, time is often the issue of making things pretty. And I like things to be clear and crisp and pretty. And I think sometimes my idea of pretty is not what other people think is pretty. So that is a challenge. And I don't know if there's really a great answer to that, for that. Because we don't have time is often a problem.
I think that Sharon this is Richard again, Sharon made a great point in the comments. Mm-hmm. And I think that the distinction between pretty and effective is a key one, right? You have to be able to communicate, and to do that, you have to know your audience. And so it's not about, are you using flashy colors? It's, does this communicate to your audience? And so if your audience really wants to get into the data tables, give them the data tables. If they just want to see what it means, then show them in ways that they can understand that. And I think that that's the key for us as professionals, right? That we try our best to communicate as clearly as we can.
Absolutely. I really think it's knowing your audience. And if you know the college that it's in, you kind of can have an idea of whether or not these are more your data focused people or your visuals and qualitative kind of focused people. But if I'm not sure, I do typically tend to ask, what does your department prefer? Do you prefer reports, or do you prefer kind of more tables and charts? And even individual faculty will tell me their preferences for how they want to see things reported. I would say colleges as a whole sometimes do. Certainly one of our colleges here that I can think of at Iowa State does have a strong preference for not as many numbers. And some other colleges, like College of Science, tend to be more into the numbers, but also depends on who is getting that report. Is it going to be the dean of that college, or is it going to be a committee within that college, and asking them what format works? And I do the same thing with faculty. I have draft fake reports that I will show them and say, does this work for you? Is this format good? And so sometimes I have tried to approach it that way if it's a new department or area that I'm working with. But yeah, going back to some of the comments on the side here, I don't know what VP's first and last name are, so I'm just going to go with VP, but how much of it depends on what they're used to seeing. So she's asking, yeah, I'd be happy to share my fake draft reports with anyone. Again, they're just things that I've made that work for our university. But yeah, so how much of, I think what VP is asking is how much of the use of data visualization depends on what they're used to seeing. Any thoughts on that? If you're unmuting yourself, then I can't hear you, so I'm just going to keep talking, and feel free to chime in. But I would say that they don't know what they like or don't like if they've never seen good visuals. They certainly will probably be used to tables or the Excel default, as Stephanie talks about in her book. But until they see a better graphic and a graphic or a visual that really drives home the point of what their data is saying, they might not know that that's what they prefer, and they might not know that's what's useful. So I think what Stephanie's book is encouraging us to do is to at least try it and see what the response is.
This is Vicki. I often have, and usually it's administration who comes to me in my role and says, I was looking at this on this website under IR, they had these tables or whatever, they're doing this, can you do that too? And sometimes, that gets to be a little overwhelming because people have different opinions on what that needs to look like amongst, a set of administrators. So I have certainly had that happen quite a bit, pretty much everywhere I've worked. So, of some influence of what they expect we should be making things look like for the public anyway, at least a website kind of view.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a lot of chat in the sidebar here I'm trying to keep up with. And one comment was about the department's style guide. And so I do have a note to get to that when we talk about color and things. So we'll definitely touch on that a little bit. And again, VP has a question. Do you find that you need to educate them on how to use or read or understand the new visuals? And I would say it depends on the visual that you're using, but yes, sometimes those things, I think, at least in my experience, they do need to be explained. in somewhat. And Sarah, are you able to unmute and talk a little bit more about those changes that you have seen?
Were you asking me?
Yeah. Are you the one that said Sarah Drummond?
Oh, no, not me.
Okay, that's in the sidebar. So Sarah Drummond had commented, we started using Tableau to look at student program assessment data. Oh, she can't unmute. Yes, we'd love to hear about those changes.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, so in my role, I'm in a specific department at Oregon Health Science University. And so I look at both programmatic and student level data. And we started instituting Tableau as a way to visualize our data, and found that through the visualization, it started to change the kinds of questions that faculty had about what we were doing programmatically, because it allowed them to see both sort of aggregate data and individual students against aggregate data, but also sort of to be able to combine more data together so that they were able to see a bigger and better picture, I think. So we found that visualizing the data was really useful for us in our work. And so I think that it's not just about making things attractive, but it's also about effectively analyzing the data that you have.
Could I ask a question of Sarah or to the group?
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm just wondering, how much time do you spend just learning how to visualize data differently, whether it be learning how to use Tableau or Excel, or I know Microsoft, I think, recently launched Power BI or something. And I think one of the barriers that I found is that usually when I'm working to visualize data is because I have a deadline that's due, because I have a report or a presentation or whatever. And so it becomes really difficult for me to try to learn a new technology while also kind of preparing for this deadline. So how do you balance that?
I'm happy to respond to that. We are just sort of trying to teach ourselves. So we started with Tableau, and then sort of each sort of report, we tried to sort of integrate something from that. And definitely there's a learning curve with the software. We're now switching to Cognos because that's what's available to us on campus and what people have more access to. But I think a lot of the skills, once you learn one visualization software and you start to think about how to best visualize your data, you can switch to different software techniques. And I like that Stephanie includes how to use Excel, which most people have access to. But I'm finding that the more that we sort of build the visuals into the different reports that we do on an annual basis, we can sort of improve them each time we do the cycle, right? So we're just getting better and better. I don't think you jump right in and have the most beautiful, well-visualized data. I mean, I'd love to be Stephanie Evergreen, but I think everybody sort of has a learning curve on that.
Yeah, and I can kind of speak to the Excel version because we've not invested in Tableau yet. But I will also mention that Stephanie will come to your institution and do, she does 1-day workshops to 3-day workshops. When I was at Virginia Tech, we had her in. And if you can dedicate a day to it, you can learn a lot of what she has to offer in a day. But she'll tell you in her workshop and in her book, everything that she goes over is on her website. So there are step-by-step tutorials. So if you can take a day of your time, there's a lot you can learn. And one of the biggest things I found to kind of help with that learning curve was to kind of, if I know that I almost always present Likert scale data, I kind of save this file as my dummy file, and I can just import the new numbers and the visual's already made. So it saves a little bit of time for having to redo things. But yeah, certainly there's a learning curve, but there's a lot you can get done with the resources that are out there, and kind of find those ones that you always do this kind of data, and that's the one I'd kind of go with first. Yep, and someone just linked Stephanie's other book there. Yeah, it's excellent. All right, I'm gonna go on to our next question, unless anyone wants to chime in and has another question. All right, so I'm gonna go back to, someone had mentioned kind of the institutional style guides and things like that. So how do we work with this type of data presentation within our institutional, let's say, color palettes or style guides or font choices? And has anyone had kind of experiences with that? And I'll copy that question to the sidebar.
Are you meaning like with branding or?
Branding, color, because let's be honest, sometimes university color palettes are not the
Oh,
prettiest.
yeah, not real pretty. Yeah. And sometimes, you know, I've had some say, well, you know, you're to use them anyway. So that is kind of difficult. Sometimes that's real limiting. And sometimes the branding can be challenging depending on the institution. I've had institutions that when I do things with branding, they require to look at it upstairs. I call it, you hear us upstairs, in communications and marketing before I, you know, produce it publicly. Or here, that's not really the case, but, you know, so yeah, those things are a challenge because there are some unpretty, you know, like reds. Oh, yes, that shows up well in every, you know, I'm like, oh, that's so dark. So yeah, or, you know, yellows and blues together can be challenging. So yeah, that's a challenge. You're right.
Yeah, there was a comment on the sidebar just now about citing accessibility. So sometimes our institutional color palettes are not the most accessible for those that are colorblind or otherwise visually impaired. So sometimes that's, even if our color palette is really pretty, that's important to think about. Is this accessible to all audiences? Or, you know, where I'm going to be publishing this, maybe it's going to be printed in grayscale, just because that's what, you know, your university requires, and thinking about how's this going to turn out. So excellent point there.
And the accessibility is an important question. I am, in fact, colorblind, which is a real challenge for an IR director. And it's definitely a challenge when you're a small office, because there's not a lot of people to check with. Is that really okay? So yeah, and then some things that look really good for me, you know, are not very pleasing to other folks either. And you know, sometimes things I'm like, I can't really distinguish that, you know, and so the world doesn't always think about that when they produce visuals. It's a good point.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. You know, it's certainly something that we should be aware of, but, you know, like some people in the sidebar are mentioning, you know, gold, kind of a yellowish gold, is very hard to see on a lot of visualizations. So hopefully you all are familiar with your university's color palette, and that there is a secondary palette for most institutions, and maybe you can find some of those other colors. But I liked Stephanie's point in the book where she talked about using gray for the non-important points of your chart, and then using the one highlight color that is the thing you want to drive home. Maybe it's, this was where the biggest change is, or this is the one thing that did change. So maybe, hopefully, we can find within our palettes, there is a time where we can use mostly grays, and then take her advice and use that one big bold color to drive home whatever that point is. And Cindy is sharing a resource there about color palettes and different forms of color blindness. There's a lot of really great resources out there on that too. Any other thoughts on how we can implement some of these data visualization techniques kind of within our university branding or guidelines? She also talked about fonts and things like that. Anybody have any thoughts on those aspects? All right. Well, hearing none, my next question was on page 126. I thought this was really interesting to look at, was the Gutenberg arrangement model. And that's something that I wasn't familiar with. I'm trying to flip to it. For those of you that don't have the book, it's kind of looks at that we typically read or typically look at a screen from the upper left-hand corner, and then we immediately kind of go down to the lower right-hand corner. And I had not really considered that type of arrangement in my reporting before. Did any folks have any opinions or any experiences or have any big aha moments with that? I thought that was interesting that she included that.
Sorry, I didn't get that far in the book.
That's okay. We're all busy folks, so I'm just going to stick that in the sidebar. Maybe if it will let me. There. But yeah, well, for me, I thought about if you go from a PC, all of your buttons for close and minimize are on the opposite side, which she kind of, the diagram refers to. Oh, a different second edition of the book. It's on pages 158, 159, or 160. So I probably have one of the older versions. But yeah, I thought about how a PC, the buttons are on what she calls the dead space, which is like the upper right-hand side. And on a Mac, my buttons tend to be on that kind of target side for that diagram. And I thought that was interesting in thinking about how we might arrange our reports with that type of flow. If anyone has any thoughts on that, feel free to chime in. Otherwise, I'm going to kind of move on to our next question. So we touched on this a little bit, but is there anything that you feel like, oh, Mindy has a question there. How do you apply that type of diagram to pages with full text? And is there any way to apply it? Did anybody get that far in the book? I would say for full page reporting, I don't think that's a thing we can really do, but she did have an example, at least in my version, where she had text heavy sections that had things a little more justified towards it's figure 5.5. I'm gonna hold it up. I don't know if you can see it on video, but it's that one that has the more text heavy page with kind of just a sidebar there. If we think about how most websites are, that's kind of what it looks like. But again, that takes up a lot of space of your reporting, so that might not be the best option. So maybe just thinking through, that's where we should arrange our diagrams when we are inserting them into a report. Typically, I insert them just kind of centered. But maybe it's better if I think about moving them up and over to the side in those reports. So that might be something to consider.
The other thing that she does, Courtney, that on the next page over, in the second edition is page 162, the what is white space and how do I use it section. Mm-hmm. So notice how she's got the call out box that gives the guiding idea. It's kind of up towards the top and the left-hand side. And that's where your eye starts. So she's using that call-out box to immediately clue you in, this is what you're supposed to pay attention to. And that's something that I found useful when I've got a lot of text. What are the key points? Can I do a call-out box with that?
Yeah, that's a really great point. Has anyone else used those to kind of call-out boxes in reporting? All right, a couple people on the side are saying sometimes, not always. Yeah, I've honestly not used one of those, but I think I should start after reading this book because, again, like we're making these reports and we want people to read them. So I think that's some really good information. She talks about the white space and also kind of the rule of thirds in there. I thought was really interesting. Vicki says she has, but rarely. Yeah, there are things that, you just don't think about because, again, most of us are from academic backgrounds and we're used to the APA format and, this one kind of way of doing things, which may not be the best for cognitive science. So, yeah, I think these things are really important to consider. So I know we have different editions here, but overall, kind of, I wanted to see what people thought about if there's anything missing, or if there's anything that you wish she talked about more in the book, or gone more in depth with.
I didn't have anything missing, but something that I thought was really neat in chapter 2, when she was talking about graphics, the graphic in the putting the graphic in the upper corner that showed how you got the findings. I thought that was really neat. So whether you got them through some kind of data collection or a phone call, or whether they were qualitative data that you got from reading student work, I thought that could be really useful in putting assessment projects out so that the faculty know where that came from.
And what chapter did you say that was in?
It's in chapter 2. I've got the second edition, so mine's on page 55.
Okay. I don't know that
graphics in the corner for whether your survey data collection methods came from paper, online, or phone calls.
Okay, I'm gonna have to flip through and see if mine had that. I had the first edition here. I think it had something similar. But yeah, that's a really interesting point, to just kind of explain where, because it's always in the report somewhere, but it's usually in tiny text and, in italics somewhere at the bottom. And I have gotten that question multiple times. It's like, which report is this from? Is this, we have several surveys that we kind of put all together in one report. It's like, what is this from? So that's excellent. I need to go through there again and see if that's in mine or not. If not, I need to check second edition.
I thought that would be really good, especially for maybe faculty that don't buy in, who are like, where are you pulling this data from? To be able to quickly tell them this is where it's coming from. So.
Absolutely. All right, Mindy has the first edition, doesn't remember seeing that either. So clearly the second edition has some new things that are updated, because as Richard was talking, I didn't have that section on white space specifically. I had a rule of thirds and a couple other things. So good to know that there are a couple updates in that second edition if you want to check that out. Any other thoughts about, I'd kind of just like to go around and with our last 10-15 minutes here and hear from everybody what your absolute favorite part, or if you could list 2 big takeaways that you might start implementing, or at least keeping an eye on in your work. So if we just kind of want to go around and take turns, and I'm going to put that question in the sidebar. If you can't unmute and chime in, feel free to respond to that there. But let's go around and hear what your big takeaways were that you might start implementing.
This is Kathy. I'll say the thing that I saw right away, I haven't read the whole book yet, but the appendix, the checklist. I'm a big checklist person. I like making them, I like using them, just like rubrics. So when I saw that, I thought, well, this is a really easy way to use when you're creating something, right? Not just to evaluate afterwards, but use it when you're creating that. And I've done a lot of design work in training over the years, so and learned a lot around advertising. So a lot of this, when I read it, reminded me of those early years when I learned how important white space really is, and all of those other things. And the other thing too, and kind of summarizing some of the things I've heard, is, not only knowing the audience, but what's it being used for? If it's just an internal report and we need the data to be good enough, right? We don't care if it looks pretty, we care that it's meaningful and effective so we can make some data-informed decisions. But if we want to send it to our accrediting body, then there's a different level of presentation that may need to be taken into consideration because it's going outside your department and it's communicating how you're doing your work. And the narrative is just as important as the graphics, right? And that's another thing that I saw in there too, about this whole thing to people going to dashboards and how just looking at data without having context, you can jump to an assumption and conclusion because you don't have the context. And I liked having that, what did she call it, more of a report format, dashboard report. So narrative and data, so that you can have some balance to give context. So those are the big things I've taken away so far.
Great, absolutely, and I can't agree more. You got to know your audience and know where that report is going, for sure. And sometimes we are generating data that's going to be published on our websites, and that's a whole different ball game. Is you don't know who's going to be looking at it, but it's going to be for the whole public to see, thanks to Google. So absolutely. We got someone in the comments that said they absolutely agree with that checklist. It helps to summarize the whole book. I like the checklist as well. And she kind of goes over the best practices in that checklist. Couple other people here said their favorite tip was on how to modify images by clicking on the picture tools. And setting it to a transparent color, making eye-catching flyers. So those are great tips as well. Anyone else want to share some of their big takeaways?
Hey everyone, it's Richard again. One of the things that I found really interesting about the book is that it made me start thinking about what exactly do we need to communicate, right? We're assessing people and we have all of this data, hopefully, and we want to communicate everything and we want to tease out all of the fun, interesting things. But there's always the question of what do you need to communicate? What does your audience need and want to hear? And so how do we focus on that? And I think that one of the neat things for me is all of the tools that she has in here are ways to really help us to focus on the piece that's necessary for our audience.
Yeah, absolutely. We have to think about those different communication styles and how we're focusing that message, because our assessment data can have a lot of different messages depending on if someone does understand that report that it came from, if they understand that survey that data came out of. Absolutely. And then I did also want to point out, again, I have the first edition. So for those of you with the second edition, this might be different. But you'd mentioned that you like checklists. She also on her website has a chart chooser that it's a great little, I'm gonna cheat really quickly because I have it pinned to my bulletin board. She has a chart chooser you can download from her website. That's a PDF, and it you can look and see what do I need to do? I need to show survey responses. These are the charts she recommends, and then you can look up that chart on her website and go through the tutorial how to do it. I must admit that I had no sway in the voting for this book, but I am a giant Stephanie Evergreen nerd. So I happen to have those extra things. So if that's something you want to get into, that chart chooser, if you just search Evergreen chart chooser, you can find it and download it. I don't think it's not in my edition of the book. I don't know if it's in the second edition, but for those people that like the checklist and things, I just wanted to let you know that that's out there. And then one more question I did want to get to, although I'll pause, if anyone else has any, favorite takeaways. I'll wait about 20 more seconds and I'll go to my last question. All right, perfect. There's a lot of chat on the side here. Excellent, but Vicki had one question that I thought would be kind of similar and good to wrap up with. So she wants to know how this has changed the way that others interact or perceive the presentation of data. So was there anything from this book that you think would change the way that you interact with your data, or the way that others might perceive your data from implementing some of these techniques?
I think that for me, this is Vicki, that I have, due to my background, we have been kind of, oh, I'm really sorry. We have kind of been instructed to, we were taught that, you are interpreting and explaining, and often in institutional research, we, for a number of reasons, either don't have time for that opportunity or feel like others may not welcome that. And that is something that is really important to me, and something that I have done in the past, but not at this institution. And I am really going to force myself to make ways to change the way I present information that is not just strictly a table anymore, and provide explanation and meaning. And the only way to create some change is you actually just have to do it. So and see the feedback. So change is sometimes hard where I am. So but maybe small change at a time. And that is something that seems really simple, but it's not been something that folks are at all accustomed to from this office. So I think that is something I am really going to work at. And some of her examples will really actually help me bring the reader in, things that I hadn't thought about, of, drawing the reader to certain components with using text or text boxes or figures differently. So I actually believe I can make some changes there.
Absolutely, and I agree with that. And Bina has a comment here that says, I thought that what I had to share was the most important about my data, but I see it's more important for me to organize my information so that audience will be able to digest it and act on it. I think it's a really great kind of summary of this book. Is it makes sense to us because we're so intimate with our data, but really being able to turn that data into something digestible and understandable for our different audiences is really important. So I think this book is a great resource to help with that. So any final thoughts or comments before we wrap up? We have a challenge from our chat here. It says, I have a challenge with how to present data in an adjustable way, while also providing data in a raw enough form so they can make their own conclusions. Yeah, I think that's a really hard balance there, because we want to be ethical in our reporting and not, sway the data one way or the other. But sometimes as an assessment professional, it may be up to us to help our departments or colleges figure out what's best to focus on. It just depends on your role. I'm so glad that we had someone from Hawaii, that this time works for you. I tried to figure out something that would work for East Coast all the way over. The next session will focus on a different book. If you did not get the email, please write to me. I'm going to type my address in here, cvengren@iastate.edu. I sent out a poll so you can vote on the next book that will be for the, I want to say it's August 10th meeting. So we're going to vote on the next book, and I hope to have the voting wrapped up by next Wednesday. And then I will send out, no, we have not picked the next book yet. So I'll send out an announcement on Wednesday on what the voting is right now. Let's see if I can tell you what the leaders are. I think there's about 12 books that were suggested when we started this group to choose from. And so I just kind of left those titles in there. If there's more titles you want to suggest, there's an option for that as well. But so go vote. It's a Qualtrics link. I posted it in Slack. post it again, and it was also sent out in the email. But if you didn't get that, email me and I will send you, make sure you get that link. Any other questions? It's not a problem. AALHE actually hosted, so thank you to Leah for helping us use the AALHE Zoom account and recording this session. So a big thanks to her for joining in to our little rogue book group that I thought, Vicki and I thought were gonna be like 20 people, but we have a lot more than that that were interested. So thank you all for that.
Yes, thank you, Leah, and thank you
Any other
for
questions, comments, thoughts? All right, well, thank you all so much, and feel free to reach out to either Vicki or myself if you have questions about the group or I didn't get the voting option. All right, thank you all. Have a great week, and watch for an email next Wednesday on which book.